Right now we're at the Bothell Pioneer Cemetery, and we are here to see the Bothell families, the Civil War connections that they have with the veterans themselves, their descendants, the men and women of the Women's Relief, the Grand Army of the Republic and the Women's Relief Corps. Because this Bothell's really unique because they're such a interconnected group, and here in the cemetery is where you can really see that. Because they're all buried together, and there's some symbols and indications on the gravestones of what these aspects of their lives were. So it's really a tangible place to see those kind of connections and how intimate and expansive they are actually too, just by kind of going through and seeing the different groups and the granddaughter and then the daughter and all the stuff. So here on this hill, you can see there's a dark colored sort of small obelisk, and that is the gravestone of David Cameron Bothell, and he's kind of the patriarch of literally the father of the Bothell family and clan, and in this whole vicinity of the cemetery, extending kind of up to these hedges here, all the way down to this gravestone here, is really filled with people that are connected to that extended Bothell family, starting with David and his wife, and so it would have their children, children-in-law, people that are married, aunts, uncles, and then of course daughters, sons, and grandsons and granddaughters, all which were here at the same time. So this era that we're talking about with the Grand Army and the Women's Relief Corps, they were all involved in it, and as well as just in early Bothell history. So there's so many angles to look at this, but it's really one big family group here of people that were important Bothell pioneers, but come out of these Civil War roots. I wound up in Bothell. I've lived in the Seattle area about 30 years. And I own a horse, and our horse lives in Woodinville, and we lived in Seattle. We had to make the commute out to Woodinville every day, so we bought a home in Bothell. In my pre-existing condition of being super obsessed with the Civil War, I just started looking around here locally, like, oh, we got this old cemetery, let's see who's there. There's some old veterans' gravestones. And once I started looking into their individual stories and the scope and depth of it, I wanted to learn more, of course, and then I inquired with the Bothell Museum as to what kind of stuff do you guys have on these guys? You know, maybe I can start writing about them a little for my public history work, and the scope of the resources that the Bothell Museum has on these families and these individuals. It was like, wow, I can get to know these. There's photos and documents, and their house is still there, and furniture and all the stuff that made these guys more personal to me than any of the other Civil War veterans. In fact, one of them, his homestead was just on a hill about a mile and a half from here. And my home and my property is part of his original homestead. So I literally have like a physical connection to the Civil War veterans here in Bothell. So they kind of my adopted hometown guys that way. But a lot of it comes from what the museum has, and allowing me to get past census documents and that kind of stuff and really see a snapshot of early Bothell because of what the museum has. And that made made me want to get involved in researching the family history and the local history as well as the Civil War side. Well, they're complementary in form and function. The GAR was very typical of that generation of fraternal organizations like the Odd Fellows and the Knights of Pythias and the Woodsmen of the World and all this stuff. But they were structured in a kind of a faux military way, so it wouldn't be a president or a grand poobah or something. It was a commander and a vice commander and an adjutant and a quartermaster. So it looked unique that way, but it still functioned the same as any organization on that level. The Women's Relief Corps mirrored that quite a bit structurally with what their mission was, but they would also have a president and a vice president in the same kind of offices. They looked really kind of different because one looked very military and one looked more normal. But they were almost just gender divided halves of something that was moving in the same direction, I guess. The GAR would focus, of course, on the veterans and orphans and widows and supporting them, but they worked as like an advocacy group or lobbying group for veterans in general to get pensions and soldiers' homes, and a lot of things like that. That the Women's Relief Corps wasn't that politically active. They were more supporting of the veterans organization. So they kind of tracked parallel, but they were slightly different. But I think once you're in the meeting room, because they all had a lot of meetings, the social aspect of it and all that was similar through the different organizations. And of course, if they were a member of the GAR, they were probably a member of the Odd Fellows or the Masons or that kind of thing. So there was just a lot of overlap as far as social versus an advocacy, or voting constituency motivated kind of group. It wasn't just that; it was social too. So it's hard to describe. It's tough because they do so much, and they oftentimes don't leave a real clear record of what these meetings are about. Like, were they planning the next event, or were they just getting together, or they celebrated each other a lot. You'll see it's like tonight's meeting was honoring former President so-and-so, and they gave her flowers and this big thing and an award and a medal and all this stuff. And you're like, well, what did she do? I don't know, but she did something, because they, so it's hard. It can be hard to pick out really what was happening in the meeting room like week to week. It helps us understand there's so many aspects of what they did that are very much taken for granted today, that I think it's good to kind of remember where these things come from. Like, we didn't always have a flag flying over the public library or a school or at sporting events, and the national anthem and this are like American civic religion of patriotism that we have now, that's, for better or worse, can be contentious. It can be celebrated. We have Memorial Day and the things that we do, and the red, white, and blue flying and all that. That all comes directly from them. In the wake of the Civil War, we didn't do that stuff after the Revolutionary War, after the War of 1812. That happens as a result of the work, the patriotic work. They called them patriotic organizations. Memorial Day is created by and for Civil War veterans, and with the support of the Women's Relief Corps. And so much of that, it's all the roots are there. So even understanding, like, why do we stand before the baseball game and the national anthem and all? The Women's Relief Corps may not be responsible specifically for standing for the national anthem before Mariners game, but that's where it originates, and it was their intentions and what they wanted to instill in society that gave birth to all of those things that we, on a daily basis, know. So looking at their lives in that way, and also they're the generation that kept the United States together in the 1860s. If that war didn't go the way that it did, from the veterans themselves and the Women's Relief Corps, the work of the women on the home front as nurses in knitting socks, or working in the shops and farms when the men were off fighting war. Same as World War II. It's a greatest generation. I mean, World War II is but the Civil War people were, I think, eligible for a title like that. And that was their work. They were obsessed with commemorating and passing that on. So the fact that it did, it's kind of nice to go back and remember them, because they wanted us to. That's why his gravestone says GAR and Women's Relief Corps on it. And it doesn't say founder of Bothell. It doesn't say Washington Pioneer or guy who liked soccer. It says Women's Relief Corps. So that's the mark that they left for us to see when we come to the cemetery. And I think it's important to realize what that means when you see those symbols. And you stand before the Mariners game. It comes from them. So we could go through the cemetery, and there's 20 Civil War veterans, actual soldiers in here, and probably 15 different types of headstones. So this is David Bothell. He's, like I said, the father of the family, and you can see Grand Army of the Republic. But he doesn't have a regular veteran's headstone. Some others do. Yeah, so this is the grave marker for John M. Keener and his wife Rachel Keener. John Keener, so he was kind of adopted by David Bothell informally. His parents died just around the time of the Civil War, so he was a neighbor. He kind of was part of the family. He migrated from Pennsylvania to Illinois with the family. Rachel Keener is Rachel Bothell, so they got to know each other as young people, wound up getting married, and then they come here together. But John Mitchell Keener was a veteran of the Civil War. It's an incredible story of when he was wounded and some things that happened to him during the war. But here, very subtly, it's hard to see because it's not engraved particularly deep and it's a little mossy, but you can see it says GAR, which is Grand Army of the Republic, and then down here for Rachel it says WRC, which is Women's Relief Corps. Both of them were very active in those organizations here in Bothell. So it's curious that of all the things they did in Bothell history, that these are the two things that they chose to mark on their gravestone above everything else. Leading citizens. His son was a very important leading Bothell citizen and in government and everything that they did to create early Bothell. He had a heavy hand in it. But the Grand Army and Women's Relief Corps is what they left for us to see. When you come up to see their gravestone, that's what they're telling us. As well as other Bothell family, it's a similar thing. And so this is the gravesite of David Cameron and Mary Ann Bothell. They were known as Grandma and Grandpa Bothell, literally the patriarch and matriarch of this whole Bothell clan. David Bothell, of course, being a Civil War veteran, and his two sons, John and George, are also here. But again, like with Keener, Rachel Keener, Mary Ann Bothell left behind the legacy of not being Bothell's grandmother or the patriarch of the town, but that she was in the Women's Relief Corps. And you can see it says WRC, and then in the center it says FCL, which is Fraternity, Charity, and Loyalty. And that was the motto and ethos, really, of the Women's Relief Corps and the Grand Army of the Republic. So everything they did, fraternity being the social stuff, the support system and network for the veterans, charity being supporting of veterans and widows and orphans, and then loyalty, which is all the patriotic work that we talked about earlier. Everything that they aspired to do or did is either under F, C, or L. So it's neat that it actually says that on here, and it expresses what they were really doing. But again, like Keener, this is what they left behind. This is the legacy that they wanted here, or their children thought they wanted here after they had passed away, emphasizing what position this really held in their lives.